Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. And as more people come in, we will just kind of have them catch up where we're at. Today, as you can see, I have a EEG hooked on because we're going to look at my raw EEG and convert some of that into the signals that we've been talking about. And so we're going to look at my raw EEG and we're going to convert that over into some of the different waveforms that we talked about in the last couple of weeks. So this should be a pretty insightful meeting in that we're going to start to talk about biomarkers, and so ways that you can look at the EEG and then see in the EEG different diagnoses, things that you might be looking for. Many times people will just look at behaviors and symptoms. Today we're going to be looking at how to look at the EEG in a way that it can actually act as a biomarker for you. So I'm going to start with sharing my screen and showing you the raw EEG. Here is one of our screens. You guys are used to seeing certain types of screen, but this is just another one that's collecting data. And in this EEG screen, I'm going to let the raw EEG run so that you can see it. Normally, you're used to seeing just a couple numbers that come up on the screen, but I want to talk to you today about how those numbers translate into real live symptoms and things that are going on neurologically in the brain. So let's run the EEG for a second. And again, this is my EEG. And so since I'm talking, my guess is my high beta, which is going to pick up some muscle activity and that kind of thing, is going to be a little bit higher. That's fine, just for the purpose of the illustration. I want you to see the EEG. I'm going to talk some through it too as we go through. So here is the EEG running, okay? And it's going really fast, so we can use this little counter here to slow it down. So I'm going to slow it down like that, okay? And then we're going to open it back up in a second. But a few things that you see on the screen. First of all, up here in the top is your raw signal, okay? This is, in and of itself, we've been talking about this the last few weeks, that this is really hard to read by itself, this raw signal. So this signal right in here, very difficult to read. What I did was I broke this down into the few different frequencies that make up the raw signal. So we've been talking about how the raw signal works from, in the case of what we're doing, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to about 32 hertz, okay? So these are the times that the EEG cycles per second. All 32 of these come into this raw signal here. But what I did here was I actually took a 2 hertz signal and I put it right in here. Okay, so this one right here is a 2 hertz signal that you're going to look at. So I'm going to speed it up for a second so that we can look at it in an actual second and see how it cycles, okay? You're looking at it over about 30 seconds, but let's look at it first let's look at it at 5 seconds, okay? And I'm gonna pause it for a second, okay? So we've talked about this, but we've got here is let's annotate this, okay? This is a really good representation of what we've been talking about. So you've got your raw signal here, which is a synthesis of all the different frequencies. And now we've got broken down into, this is a 2 hertz frequency. This is a 16 hertz frequency, okay? And this is a 30 hertz. Now remember, all these things come together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 32 into this guy. He's the combination of that. Also, you're going to see this a lot when you're doing assessments, okay? This is another representation of it. And you'll notice the scale, 0 up to 32. Okay, those are all the frequencies. And this is how the wavelengths are kind of rising, going into peaks and valleys, okay? But before you look at that, you got to understand, here is a 2 hertz frequency. So it's very interesting if I start at 1 minute and 40 seconds, which is right here, okay? And I go to 141, okay, right here, what you'll see is we get 1 and we get 2 hertz. So that means it's cycled twice. Now let's look at a 16 hertz. 1 second here, and look what it did. It cycled 16 times in that 1 second. And then here's a 30 hertz frequency. And again, over 1 second, okay, it cycled 30 times. And that's all of those together, 32 of them, goes up into the signal here. We're not really concerned much about that signal. We're concerned about the distribution of these cycles. So let's look at this again, okay? And I want to drive home one point, major point, before we really start to talk about biomarkers here, okay? So let's let this run. I'm going to move it to actually even shorter. We're going to go to 3 seconds, okay? And then I'm going to pause it. Okay, so again, here's the 2 hertz. Over here, this one, that means it cycled twice. That's a delta wave. This is a 16 hertz. That's a low beta wave. And this is a 30 hertz, and that's a high beta wave, okay? Now, this is a very important point to remember moving forward, okay? The frequency, how many times it cycles in a second is always the same. It's always the same, how many times it cycles in a second, okay? It's kind of like, let's say we take somebody whose name is Bill, okay? His name is Bill, that's his name, that describes who he is, just like 2 hertz. That's the name of that, and it falls in a category called delta. So there's a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4, and those make up delta, okay? And that's kind of like Bill, Tom, Sam, and Patrick, okay? They all make up this group of people, okay? So there's different frequencies. That never changes, but what does change is the height of that frequency. So look at this one. You can see it particularly in the 16 hertz one. Okay, you see the 16 hertz, here's 1 second. And what do you notice about the 1 second? Is yes, there's 16 cycles. However, the height, this is so important to understand, the height changes, meaning there's more intensity in that cycle when the height gets higher or the amplitude is higher. That cycle is being represented more. It's absorbing more electrical current. It's always going to cycle 16 cycles a second, but at that moment in time, like in this case, okay, this case, the 16 hertz is dominant versus maybe a half a second earlier where it wasn't very dominant, okay? You can also see that here in the high beta one, which is at a 30 hertz, right? It's cycling 30 cycles, but the first half of the second, there's not a lot going on in it. And then all of a sudden it gets a little bit higher, meaning there's more going on in those higher frequencies. And down in this waveform, in this 3D image, it would have been when we saw one of these peaks, okay? When you're looking at the 3D image, those peaks are when one of these frequencies starts to exhibit more power in it and the amplitude shoots up. So if I take Bill, he's always Bill, But Bill might, as he gets older, he might get taller, okay? Or he might get stronger, or he might change in some way physically in how he's seen, but he's always Bill, okay? A delta wave is always a delta wave, but it can change in how it looks. It can get stronger or weaker, just like Bill or Patrick or whoever. They're always that. And that gets a little confusing because we use a number to describe them, like 2 hertz, which is the actual frequency down here. But then at the same time, we use a number to describe its height, like 2 units of amplitude, okay? And so then it gets kind of confusing, okay? But very important that we understand that. And it's those representations of height and valley that start to act as the biomarker for different things that people experience, okay? So let's take a look at mine. We're gonna run this for a second. And I'm gonna transfer these into a graph that you're gonna be able to understand in a second. And that will segue us into our discussion of biomarkers. So hopefully you understand that. You've got these different frequencies. They all do different things. We've talked about this the last couple of weeks. You've got your parasympathetic ones, which are deltas, thetas, alphas. They're responsible for resting. So disorders where there's things going on where somebody's more fatigued or having sleep problems or focusing issues that are related to slow waves, we're going to want to be looking at those delta, thetas, and alphas. And then you've got your perfect set of brain waves where the cycling is just exactly fuel efficient for the brain. Those are SMRs and low betas. Those are 12 to 20. And then 20 hertz and higher are sympathetic brain waves. They're going really fast. So any disorders related to anxiety, PTSD, chronic pain, addictions, those kind of things are all going to be housed up in these higher frequencies. They get represented more, or they're dominating the brain when the amplitude of that frequency gets stronger, okay, or higher. And we're going to see that in a second. So let's let mine run. I'll try to close my eyes and see if I can bring my high beta down. It's a little hard when we're talking, but let's go ahead and let this run for a minute or so. And then I'm going to transfer this into a graph that looks pretty cool. Okay. Okay, a little hard to bring that down when we're on video, but I want to just get some numbers that we can work with here. Okay, again, first thing you should start to see is you notice the amplitudes of the frequencies are changing. And so those amplitudes are what feed into these numbers. So we're going to see these in a second here. So what I'm going to do is we're going to take all my values, okay, and we're going to put them over here in a spreadsheet. Okay. Okay. Now, what you should be able to see here on the screen is all the different frequencies. We're missing a few, but just for the sake of our discussion today, I threw a few up on the board. Don't have them all, but these are the slow frequencies are sitting over here. Okay, so if I go 12 and lower, let's say right about here. Oh, sorry. Arcane. Okay, so anything from 12 and lower would be the parasympathetic brainwaves. Anything from 20 and higher would be the fast brainwaves, okay? So as we're looking at this, what I want to do is see how are these distributed. And you can see right out of the chute, okay, that there is a downward sloping, but then at the end, I kind of tail up a little bit, okay? So instead of keeping the downward slope, I've got these high frequencies here. Now, if I go back and I look at my high beta ratio, it's a little bit higher. It's a 1.8, okay? And that's because the amplitudes, the frequencies stay the same, but the amplitudes of them over time are higher, and that's causing an issue. So one of the questions is, you know, well, what is the exact slope that I'm looking for? Like, how do I know when I'm starting to look at the image, or if I'm looking at a 3D, how do I find that slope that is ideal, okay? Well, we know a few things, okay? What we know is that when it comes to the volume of theta, which is 4 to 8 hertz, okay? So these guys right down here, 4 to 8 hertz, compared to the volume of 16 to 20 hertz, okay? We know that if I take the theta, 4 to 8 hertz, and I put it over top of 16 to 20 hertz, okay, which is low beta, okay, that ratio of those two volumes, so the heights, the amplitudes of those, okay, that when I do that in a mathematical formula, that the ideal spot is 2.4. That would be the ideal distribution of those brainwaves. Okay, now if we look back at where I was about a 2.1 or 2.2, okay, meaning that that's a little bit lower. But a way to look at this would be to say, okay, if the average of these is sitting right around 3.1, okay, right in here, then I would expect that the average of this to get this ratio, okay, would be sitting somewhere slightly above 1.1, okay? And we can kind of see that here, okay? Actually, I'm a little bit higher in my low beta. So this slope right here is actually pretty close to what we're looking for in a brain where the theta ratio is right around 2.4, okay? Now we can calculate that exactly, what that slope is, but it should look something like this. Now in the area of high beta, the way that that should look is a slope that these SMRs are falling right here. And then these, to create a high beta ratio of where high beta over top of what's called SMR, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, that's that perfect rhythm, okay? That number, ideally, what we'd love to see is that number is less than 1, okay? Well, you can see right away, if I start to calculate these high frequencies here, okay, these high beta frequencies, and I put them over top of these frequencies, well, that's not going to be less than 1, okay? That's actually going to be higher, and you saw that. You saw that mine was a 1.8, but the actual appropriate slope here from the SMRs to the high betas would look something like this, okay? And you can see when we look at my brain that my issue is not my thetas. My thetas are almost exactly where they need to be, but my issue is more in the high beta because these amplitudes are too high. You remember we saw the frequency stays the same, but the amplitudes can change. So for me, I can look at this and I can say the biomarker in relation to stress is really higher right now, which makes sense, I'm doing a webinar, trying to get the technology to all work, all that kind of stuff, right? And when I look at my EEG, I don't have to tell you, okay, I feel a little bit stressed, or maybe I don't feel stressed. I can look at my EEG and say, that distribution is not correct for a healthy EEG. Because in order to create this ratio, that slope should look like this, and there shouldn't be these high amplitudes going on, okay? So let's clean some of this up, and let's talk about some specific, more diagnostic biomarkers, okay? And we're gonna go out to the whiteboard. Okay, so we're gonna think of our x-axis, our y-axis, and our x-axis, right? That we just looked at. And we know that the slope needs to look something like this, okay? And just for the purpose of our discussion today, we're gonna primarily deal with, we have the sympathetic brain waves at this end. These are the high betas. We have the parasympathetic brain waves down here. These are the delta, theta, and alphas. And then we've got 12 to 20 hertz in the middle here, okay? And these are gonna be the SMR and low beta, okay? So when we're thinking about different disorders, we want to see what are the distributions across these different bandwidths. So let's first start with anxiety, okay? So the ideal slope is the red line, okay? If I saw a slope that looked like this yellow line, okay, I would know two things from a biomarker, okay? First of all, I would know that we have got way too much extra current here, and there's something going on in an anxiety response. The higher that high beta gets, so the marker that we're going to say is when we start to get greater than 2.0 of the high beta ratio, we now know that these high beta ratio or these high frequencies are getting twice as high as they should be, indicating some type of problem in too much elevation of this high beta frequency, okay? And that's going to be representative of anxiety. Other things that could be a biomarker for when this gets greater than 2.0, things to think about. Let's type up a few here, okay? I want you to be thinking about when you see that high beta gets above 2.0, we definitely want to think about just general, anxiety, okay? But we also might be thinking about OCD, could be thinking about some PTSD. The higher this gets, if we get up in the 3s, okay? Physiologically, you might be thinking about maybe is there migraine. You might be thinking about chronic pain. These are all sympathetic responses. You might be thinking some type of insomnia. Okay. You could also be looking at physiologically, you could be looking at things like high blood pressure. Okay, you could be looking at some weight issues. Just chronic stress. The list goes on. We've talked about these things that are all sympathetic. You remember Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers book. That's going to be all things when we start to see these, the yellow line start to tail up, not the red line, but we start to see these frequencies happen that are elevated, that we know that we've got too much of those high elevations in those fast frequencies, okay? The flip side of it that I want you to look at over here is, notice the yellow line is low here, meaning that instead of these slow frequencies having nice high amplitudes, like we looked at earlier, they're actually very shallow. They're still cycling the same time, okay? So like a 2 hertz is still doing 2 cycles a second, but the height of it is really low. And the problem with that is these are where I'm supposed to be doing all my recovery, okay? All my restoration at night all comes in these frequencies down here. So if there's not a lot of them, their heights aren't high, then what I know is that we're not filling this gap here, okay? Especially the lower I go, 0 to 4 hertz. If there's a real gap in this, like sometimes this yellow line might actually start to come up a little bit and then come down and then go up. But I see this real pocket here at the beginning of the frequencies. Okay, if that was going to happen, if I saw this pocket in that yellow line going across, I know before I even look at it that the theta ratio is going to be super low. Okay, it's probably going to be less than 1.2, which, what does that tell me? It tells me we've got some type of chronic sleep thing going on. Okay, there's something going on when I see this kind of really low valley in those first 4 hertz that the brain isn't recovering correctly. So I'm thinking, you know, chronic fatigue. I'm definitely thinking of some type of sleep disorder. I might even be wondering about, is this the precursor to some type of memory issue? Because sleep is so important to REM sleep, and REM sleep is where we consolidate memories. And if that theta ratio, we get that little dip at the beginning of the EEG in 0 to 4 hertz, we know we're not getting that restoration. If that's chronic over time, that's going to lead to some memory problems, possibly dementia, Alzheimer's, those kind of things, all related to this little dip right here on the yellow, okay? Then typically what happens is it starts to rise at the end, like we saw earlier here, right? We saw that rise. Well, it's rising because it hasn't got the rest it needs, so it's more anxious. Okay, so a lot of times from a biomarker, you'll see both going on. The anxiety is represented in that rise at the end of those frequencies, and the sleep is related to the bottoming out of those first 4 frequencies, okay? Let's go ahead and look at a couple more biomarker disorders. So in this case, the anxiety and all that stuff, I'm looking at low theta ratios and high beta ratios, okay? Let's look at a couple other ones, okay? So we got our y-axis, got our x-axis, and let's do our ideal line, which is going to be the slope that we calculated earlier. That's going to look like this, okay? Tails off to nothing, and we're going from 0 to 32 hertz, okay? We know that this slope from the theta to the low beta should be 2.5 to 1. So if this was at 2.5 right here, the height, at that point, the halfway point of the thetas, then I know that the halfway point of the 16 to 20 hertz would be at 1. And that would be the pitch. That would be the perfect pitch. But as that pitch gets low, we start to see these parasympathetic issues. And then on the flip side, the other one I want to talk to you about is what happens if it starts to rise. So that means I'm getting more theta and less low beta or 16 to 20. Then I'm getting something like this. So let's go with a green line. Let's say I get something like this where it's high and then it drops down, and then it might tail off like that. This green one, so what is this one, okay, from a biomarker standpoint? This one's actually been identified as by the FDA as a true biomarker for ADHD, okay? So again, we've got our slow are our parasympathetic brainwaves. We've got our ideal brainwaves. And then we've got our, actually this is parasympathetic. And then we got our fast ones here, sympathetic. So what's happening here is instead of those frequencies landing at the right heights in their amplitudes, the thetas have huge spikes in them, okay? Their amplitudes are high. And then the low betas, 16 to 20, their amplitudes are lower than they should be. So when we calculate that ratio, what happens then is that the theta ratio, instead of being low, like in memory issues and those kind of things, now the theta ratio is 3.0. And that's been identified for 30 years now as a biomarker for ADHD. Okay, we know that. So when you see a slope like that, it's not just a matter of filling out a checklist. This tells me that the person's issue is they have too much of these slow waves, and so it makes it very hard for them to focus. And then the brain waves that manage impulse control are non-existent, so then they become more impulsive. Consequently, if I was to give this brain a stimulant, like an amphetamine, okay, what would that amphetamine do? It would actually cause some increases down here and some suppression here. And so then the person would feel like they're focusing better. But the problem is we haven't solved that problem. We've just used an amphetamine or a stimulant to speed up the parasympathetic brainwaves. And then once that wears out of the system, then we're right back to where we started, and we're back up on the green line, which we don't want to have happen. Next week, we're going to talk about, well, how do we shift this? But the biomarker for ADHD looks like this. And a lot of times you won't see a bunch of high elevations down here on the end, like you saw with the anxiety people. They're kind of checked out, and it's hard for them to focus. Now, when you do see something where it tails up at the end, you start to wonder, is it really ADHD, or is there an anxiety component that maybe we need to address first, and that the theta is just a reaction to the brain running so fast? So when I see kind of a double rise here, I want to address this first before addressing this, because many times the theta is just trying to compensate for all of this extra activity here, kind of like a pendulum swinging back and forth. Okay, let's talk about a couple more. Okay, and then we will kind of finish up. Okay, let's look at there's our Y and X. Let's do our line. Okay, this is the ideal. Oh, sorry. The ideal looks like this. Okay, tails off, right? I'll just throw this one out here. We don't spend a lot of time on this one, but this is pretty well documented in the literature, is that in movement disorders, particularly something like Parkinson's, what you're going to see is we have our slow waves, our parasympathetic brain waves. We have our ideal waves, and we have our fast waves, our sympathetic ones. But there's been a couple interesting studies where, for some reason, these 11 to 12, 11 to 13 hertz, very specific, these bottom out, like they almost become non-existent. And it looks very odd to see it. Is you see all the mountain range, you know, the mountain range we saw earlier, it's all kind of cruising along, and then all of a sudden there's this like big cavity in here. And you'll see this in movement disorders, because this is where a lot of our balance and a lot of our stability comes from, is this set of brainwaves here. So that's kind of an unusual one. You'll probably never run across it, but this little, where the whole 11 to 13 hertz just, it's almost non-existent. Okay. Let's look at a couple other things. If somebody was using marijuana and they came in, what you would probably see is pretty decent amount. Well, it would look something like this. probably wouldn't have enough of this. And then what you're going to see is a spike right here. Then you're going to come down. And then depending on if they're not using at the moment, but they chronically use, you'll probably see something like this. Okay, so what's going on here? Okay, so many times when we're seeing, and this isn't just marijuana use, this is other substances, but particular for marijuana use, is what you'll see is the presenting issue is typically this right here, okay? Is that those frequencies, those amplitudes or those fast frequencies are dominating the brainwave. And we know from our earlier discussion that that produces more, that when we see that rise there, okay, that what we're gonna get is more anxiety, okay? But what the person finds is when they use marijuana that they feel like the anxiety is subsiding. Well, why is that happening? Why that happens is the marijuana causes a significant rise in these brainwaves right here, which is fascinating. This is also why it works well for chronic pain, because in a chronic pain situation, again, you're very stressed and there's an anticipatory stress and that's kicking up. But when you use marijuana, what happens is you get this little bubble here where there's a rise. And what that does is it creates an extra surge of this whole sympathetic, parasympathetic volume here, okay? And so that extra surge is a calming factor, okay, where this thing starts to fill in. And it's because the chemical produces what are called more alpha waves. So alpha waves cycle 8 to 12 hertz. And so that would mean that in 1 second, we're going to get 8 of these sine waves, right? Okay. But when I use marijuana, I still get 8 or 9, but the heights of them become really tall. They dominate. And that's what creates this bubble here. Okay. And that creates a temporary relief of the anxiety over here. The problem is what happens is that doesn't last forever. And the bubble goes down, okay? And then I'll have changes in my appetite and that kind of thing because of that. And then when the bubble goes down, then what I tend to get is maybe even a little bit more rise in my underlying anxiety than I might have even had originally, okay? And then we start this cycle of back and forth of swinging the autonomic. All it is an autonomic nervous system change, back and forth. And it creates some temporary relief. Does it actually change? Yes, it does. But there's not a permanent relief of that because we're not really addressing the underlying anxiety, okay? Let's deal with one last one, okay? And it's very similar to the marijuana one. So let's put our Y and let's do our X. Let's do our curve, right? This is the norm curve that we know statistically the brain's working well off of, okay? And what you're gonna see, we have our parasympathetic ones, we have our ideal, and we have our sympathetic. And these are running 20 hertz and higher. Well, back in the 80s and 90s, a bunch of researchers wanted to look at, well, what happens in substance abuse? We talked a little bit about marijuana, but in substance abuse in general, alcohol use, other substances. And what's a very interesting thing that happens is it's not just an elevation of the fast waves, like we've seen in anxiety, where it just tends to be this whole thing's a little bit higher, okay? Actually, let's do it this way. That's typically what we'll see in anxiety, is they're all just high. But it's very interesting in substance abuse and particularly in OCD, what you'll see is a really sharp spike at 27 to 28 hertz, okay? This frequency seems to be the dominant frequency for substance abuse and some underlying OCD, obsessive compulsive behaviors. Now, this is the problem, okay? And that's what creates the intensity. But the reason that they're might be using the alcohol or another substance is to try to relieve this issue. So it's a self-medication to try to drive this guy down, because this is very uncomfortable, that spike, that rumination in the brain that won't shut down. And typically what happens is when they use that drug of choice, what happens is then they might get a rise over here, okay, which then kind of dulls the senses, much like what we saw with marijuana, but in other ways, alcohol can do this, maybe not as specific as the alpha frequencies. It may go down into delta and theta with alcohol, and other substances might do. A lot of the issues with pain medicines, those kind of things, is they're trying to dull these responses down here and create a heightened, slow response. The problem is there's this relief that happens, which is okay, because now we've kind of brought some more emphasis down here. But once that drug wears off and we start to go in the other direction and things drop off, right? Now I've created this cycle where what starts to happen to my peak again, the rumination, the anxiety, the tension, is it starts to rise, okay? And the only way that I can resolve that is to go back to this and try to artificially create that dulling or deadening of the senses, okay? Now we're going to talk about next week, how do we actually adjust the heights of these without having to do that either through a prescription med for anxiety, sleep, those kind of things, or for self-medication, okay? The same principles underneath the surface with the autonomic nervous system are going on in substance abuse as many times are going on in other prescription meds that we might use. We're trying to adjust the system to relieve some of the tension in the electrical current, okay? So we'll finish up. Hopefully that was helpful. It was great working with you guys today. And next week, we're going to talk about how do we go about not just chemically moving the electrical current, but how do we make these changes where there's permanent changes and we engage in what's called a ligand-gated change, or we engage in a voltage-gated change versus a ligand-gated change, which ligands is more chemicals. That's all the things that we talked about, adjusting the electrical current via different substances or chemicals. But a voltage-gated change is actually teaching those frequencies to decrease their amplitude or increase their amplitude based on feedback or operant conditioning. Okay? You guys have a good one. Good talking to you. We may play this again next week. If so, and you hear it again, it might be good for a second time, or those of you that couldn't join us today, it'd be good for you to hear this, because this is very important as we lead into the difference between ligand and voltage-gated changes in the brain.